Hello and salutations, my fellow philosophers. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie podcast, in which we explore the intersection of spirituality and philosophy, and how we can lead more holistic and meaningful secular lives. And speaking of lives, death! What hasn't already been said of it? It's a part of the natural cycle of life, it's the terminus of this phase of consciousness, or maybe it's just one long peaceful nap. For Easterners, death is the revolving door our souls enter at the conclusion of our allotted time here on earth, and death plays a focal role in their daily lives. Whereas for us Westerners, we don't even talk about death to begin with. You can see this avoidant attitude most evidently in the fact that in most U.S. towns, our graveyards always exist just on the borders of the city limits. Americans are notoriously afraid of anything that reminds them of their timely demise. Instead of confronting this harsh truth, they live a life that makes them feel dead inside. Ironically, our rapid dismissal of death actually prevents us from living lives that are the antithesis of death. By tucking death under the rug, we are denying the fullness of life because we are not opening ourselves up to each and every one of its aspects. This includes death in all its horror and glory. The fact that we die is often misconstrued as one of the most repressive and limiting aspects of existence. But in reality, this truth holds beneath it immense empowerment. Death is the deadline to this creative project we call life itself, and it can abruptly end at any moment. This infuses our agency, whether illusory or not, with a real deep-seated feeling of meaningfulness and purpose that compels us and drives us forward. Memento mori is what compels us to live out authentic lives, because no matter what you do, it'll be a waste anyways because we're all gonna die. So we may as well live out the grandest life so that we can go out in a blaze of glory. So we may as well make it worth it in the end. Okay, if death isn't so scary and can enhance our experience of life, then how do we actually start to use it to our advantage? How can we co-opt death to live magnanimous lives? This is where ancient philosophy comes into play. Cicero once said, quote, "To philosophize is to learn to die." What exactly does this mean, though? Wouldn't self-inflicted torture make for a better training regimen for death? Not exactly. Philosophy, in Socrates' perspective, was meant to train us to cultivate a cheerful attitude, a cheerful disposition upon our deaths. Whenever a philosopher who practiced the art of dying is on death's door, they are able to embrace it cheerfully because their love of wisdom has granted them a soul that can pass on with the satisfaction of a good, clean conscience. How we encounter death is the ultimate test of our virtue and wisdom, and the final moment we can prove to ourselves whether or not we lived happy lives. This has been philosophy's teleology ever since the very birth of it, to train ourselves in the art of dying. In today's episode of the podcast, we will learn exactly that. We will talk about how interlinked philosophy and death truly are, some philosophical justifications to not fear death, and last but not least, how we can begin our training regimen in the art of dying. To begin today's discussion, however, we need to understand one crucial thing. Philosophy existed before Socrates thanks to thinkers like Pythagoras and Democritus, but Socrates' death radically transformed what it entailed exactly. If it wasn't for his martyrdom, classical philosophy would not have gained the influence it had on the ancient world. Nietzsche even says that his death was, quote, "the turning point and vortex of world history," end quote. Because Socrates transfigured philosophy from cosmology and metaphysics towards spiritual self-examination and an embodied way of living philosophically. Philosophy was no longer restricted to intellectual speculation, but rather a living and ethical drama. This enriching drama began when Socrates was told by the Oracle of Delphi that there is none in Athens wiser than himself. Socrates thought this to be utterly absurd because the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. If that's the case, then what is he to make of those who profess their wisdom and folly? Being compelled to enact a divine mission from the god Apollo, Socrates questioned all of Athens like an annoying gadfly in order to snap Athens out of its delusions and ignorance. And because of this, he was sentenced to death because he would rather die than live unjustly and untruthfully. To not philosophize for Socrates would be like telling a professional singer to never use their voice, which is worse than death itself. His adamant refusal shows that a life without inquiry is not worth living, and that the true harm comes from not dying, but from becoming morally compromised. In the Phaedo, Socrates says, quote, I am afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for death and dying, end quote, 64a. In this way, his stance turns philosophy into the art of dying, a practice of facing fear, holding inner integrity and authenticity above survival, and meeting one's end with clarity and courage. Philosophy and death have always been tightly interlinked. Albert Camus was on the right track when he said that, quote, there is but only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide, end quote. Death is the launch pad for nearly all philosophical contemplation, because it forces us to confront every fundamental question about human existence all at once. Some of the greatest questions in life all revolve around death. Is there a soul? Does our consciousness get annihilated at death? What does it mean to truly exist? What is the I that dies? Why should we even bother with any of this? What's the point? What's the purpose? Even the question of what do we truly know lurks behind death's shadow, because we do not know anything that happens after this life. Death thus becomes the very edge of reason itself, and the boundary between knowledge and uncertainty. When we face our mortality, all the distractions and illusions fall away, and we're pushed to ask what truly matters, how we ought to live, and what kind of person we want to become. Philosophers across all traditions have recognized that death reveals the nature of the self, grounds our ethics, and gives urgency and meaning to our choices. It exposes the limits of what we can know while also freeing us from the fears that keeps us unfree and unawake. This is why Socrates, the Stoics, the Buddhists, and even existentialists all treat the contemplation of death not only as an intellectual exercise, but also as a spiritual exercise. By learning how to face death with clarity, we learn how to live with purpose, honesty, and courage. So how can we become like Socrates even in the face of death? It is to overcome our fear of complete oblivion and annihilation with no hope for redemption in the afterlife. The modern philosopher Simon Critchley wrote a wonderful and witty book called The Book of Dead Philosophers, and he pitches it off with one simple assumption. He claims that what defines human life in our corner of the planet at the present time is not just a fear of death, but an overwhelming terror of annihilation. It's safe to say that death is one of mankind's greatest fears, and the courageous contemplation of it is how we conquer that fear, kind of through a kind of exposure therapy. This is what the art of dying entails, how we can live a life that balances on the edge with death, which is not held back by our self-inflicted chains of delusion that restricts us from accepting life in all its majesty. Critchley later quotes the French Renaissance philosopher and creator of the essay, Michel de Montaigne, who famously said that, quote, to practice death is to practice freedom. A man who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave, end quote. Critchley then reflects on this by saying that, quote, this is an astonishing conclusion. The premeditation of death is nothing less than the forward thinking of freedom. Seeking to escape death, then, is to remain unfree and run away from ourselves. The denial of death is self-hatred, end quote. Life can't be defined without death, and if we neglect this aspect of existence in our lives, we are not truly living and are committing murder to our very souls. By denying death, we are restricting our abilities to truly know thyself, and in so doing, we neglect the care for ourselves. To truly know thyself is to care for ourselves, and if you neglect your soul, you will accomplish nothing in this life, according to Socrates. The Socratic maxim to know thyself is not just an intellectual query, but a spiritual living practice. However, this whole staring into the face of death with no fear idea sounds much easier said than done, because it simply is. It is called the art of dying after all, and not the ineptitude of dying. Conquering our fear of death is the first crucial act necessary towards fully embodying the art of dying. But how can we go about doing this exactly? Some ancient schools of philosophy thought that reason grants us the power to not be controlled by our passions, and that logic can actually lead us towards an inner peace which is aligned with nature and the greater cosmos. The Stoics and Epicureans were masters at understanding how much of our perspective of death are ruled by faulty critical thinking and by emotions misguiding us, and they talked about how we can truly align ourselves with reason. In the school of Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius tries to appease the fear of death by coming to the realization that we won't actually experience the sensation of death because, well, we'll already be dead. Or not. Marcus writes in Book 8 of his Meditations that, quote, "He who fears death either fears the loss of sensation or a different kind of sensation altogether. But if thou shalt have no sensation, neither wilt thou feel any harm. And if thou shalt acquire another kind of sensation, thou wilt be a different kind of living being, and thou wilt not cease to live." End quote. Either we die and go into blissful sleep with no more painful sensations, or we will altogether transmutate into a new creature, get reincarnated, or our life energy gets redispersed into the cosmos, which was a view Marcus himself was privy to. Whether or not death is a dispersion of atoms or a complete annihilation of them, it makes no difference because it is either change or extinction. For Marcus, death simply is change and transformation. And because of that, we are always dying in a way and undergo many deaths throughout this life. You probably have heard the phrase before that the moment you were born, you have already started to die, and this rings true in Book 9 of his Meditations. Marcus later writes that, quote, "All things are changing, and thou thyself art in continuous mutation, and in a manner of continuous destruction, and the whole universe too." End quote. All of life is constantly feeding on the energy of the dead in order to gain new vibrancy and aliveness. Even though we are alive, we still must go through perpetual death cycles where our past selves are dying so that we can make space for something new to come and take its place. Life is a cycle of endless regeneration and destruction, and our souls become aligned with nature when we reconcile this truth within. Marcus later writes in the same book, quote, "Turn thy thoughts now to the consideration of thy life as a child, as a youth, thy manhood, thy old age. For in these also every change was a death. Is this anything to fear? In like manner then, neither are the termination and cessation and change of thy whole life a thing to be afraid of." End quote. We are always in the phase of transformation, and our past selves are in a sense dead, for we can never return to our childhood. Our personalities are constantly evolving, and our opinions and values also change in the process, and due to this, it can be said that we undergo a psychological death anytime we change our perspective of reality and of life in general. Although the Stoics in general are not afraid of the concept of annihilation, their belief in the Logos, a kind of universal Tao found in Taoism, as a universal pervading life essence, still provided them great comfort in their contemplation of death. Whereas the Epicureans were able to find solace in death without any kind of comfort from the divine whatsoever. Epicurus found a school of philosophy which rivaled that of the Stoics and Cynics back in antiquity. In it, he was one of the first philosophers to have argued for a materialistic and naturalistic worldview. Epicurus believed that the soul didn't exist, and that the gods did not interfere in our lives. Despite what their more religious compatriots thought, Epicureans were able to face death with assured peacefulness while having no hope for an afterlife. The Epicurean way of life consisted of trying to attain what is called ataraxia in the Greek, or otherwise known as freedom from pain and mental disturbances. And Epicurus concocted his fourfold cure known as the tetrapharmakos, which, when you break down this word, tetra means four, and pharmakos means remedy or drug, or otherwise known as the fourfold cure. Epicurus' tetrapharmakos prescribes us to do the following. Don't fear God, don't worry about death. What's good is easy to get, and what's terrible is easy to endure. It's easy for us moderns to not fear the gods simply because we don't believe in them as much anymore. But how exactly was Epicurus able to not fear death in an era of rampant paganism? He taught that, quote, "Death does not concern us, because as long as we exist, death is not here. And once it does come, we no longer exist." End quote. We are not scared of the void of emptiness before our birth, so why should we worry about it after our lives? Our lives exist only in the present, so past and future be damned altogether. When we die, we're no longer alive and are incapable of actually experiencing what death is like. All we know is what the process to die is like, but after we take our last breath, what remains is a mystery because we no longer possess our sensing faculties and conscious awareness of time. Although our lives are sandwiched between eternity and nothingness, we shouldn't be afraid of death because when it comes, we won't experience any pain, fear, and anxiety because the self is simply not there anymore. When we exist, death isn't here, but when death is here, we won't exist to experience it. The latter half of the Tetrapharmakos helps us to live fuller lives when we are enlightened to this insight. The idea that what is good is easy to get is true for the Epicurean, who prizes the simple pleasures of life. And the fact that what is bad is easy to endure provides us with inner comfort, because when we face death someday, it will only be for a short stint compared to the span of life we got to experience. And just a little fun fact for you. From this doctrine of the Tetrapharmakos arose the epitaph non fui, non sum, non curo. I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. This epitaph was inscribed on the gravestones of Epicurus' followers and seen on many ancient gravestones of the Roman Empire. I mean, how cool and badass is that? This epitaph highlights the almost zen-like attitude of tranquility and indifference Epicureans felt in regards to the fleeting nature of existence. By fully accepting the cycle of life and death, Epicureans were able to fully embody their ideal of ataraxia and inner tranquility while existing eternally in the present moment. So if philosophical and rational insights provide the blueprint for the art of dying, then what are the tools we need to solidify our spiritual practice? They are spiritual exercises, which I have referenced before plenty of times throughout the channel, and from the philosopher Pierre Hadot's work, and the first episode of this podcast itself. But to serve as a quick refresher for those new to the subject, Pierre Hadot and some of Michel Foucault's later work before his early death recognized in ancient philosophy that it was not merely an intellectual query, but rather philosophy was lived as a way of life. Rational discussion was necessary but not sufficient for a well-lived eudaimonic life. What Hadot called spiritual exercises was necessary to produce the fruits of eudaimonia and virtue. These spiritual exercises were voluntary practices, one engaged in which aimed at cultivating the self by radically transforming one's entire being, their entire mind, body, and soul, in the light of wisdom and truth. Some common examples of spiritual exercises found in antiquity, according to Philo of Alexandria, were focusing our attention through mindfulness, or prosochi in the Greek, remembrance of good things, pursuing self-mastery, reading, and taking the view from above, which Marcus Aurelius is known for in his meditations. I'm taking some liberty here by highlighting what could be labeled as spiritual exercises, but I'm willing to expand them so that they're more centered around the topic of death and how we can better relate to it. So if you have any qualms or rebuttals, please do not hesitate to bring them alight to me in the comments below, because I'm still exploring this topic and I'm still learning myself. This is what the ancient Greeks called melete thanato. Melete means to study, to meditate. The modern term meditation is a Latin translation of this Greek word melete. And thanato means death, or to die, or to be dying. So melete thanato means meditations on death. The first melete thanato, or death meditation, is one you've surely heard of before, and that is memento mori. The phrase derives from Latin and simply means, remember that you must die. The contemplation of death was quite common throughout classical antiquity. Plato's Phaeo gives an account of Socrates exemplifying for us how to live philosophy proper, which is, quote, about nothing else but dying and being dead, end quote. Through meditating on our deaths regularly, it enables us to view life with complete clarity, free from any denial whatsoever. Marcus Aurelius tried to remind himself of the following, quote, do not act as if thou were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over thee. While thou livest, while it is in thy power, be good, end quote. Death hangs over us like the clouds in the sky, not always within our grasp, but always within sight. Because of this, it serves us as a reminder to live virtuously and to not get caught up in the whims of the ego. In fact, remembering our deaths is a surefire way to thwart any plans our untamed egos have of living forever. In Roman times, when a victorious general returned from the war front, they received all kinds of accolades during street parades. At the height of all this praise, the Roman general advisor would then sneak up behind them and whisper behind their ears, memento mori, remember that you must die. Today, that advisor would be a massive buzzkill, but in ancient times, it was reminders like that which enhanced the experience by suffusing the present moment with a greater sense of preciousness. If you aspire to the aesthetics of Shakespeare, you could place death decor like little skulls in your humble abode to help give you a visual reminder of memento mori. The eccentric philosopher Montaigne took this to the extreme by following an ancient Egyptian custom of bringing a skeleton out to the feast table during holidays and festivities, as he and his friends would all cheer, "Drink and be merry, for when you're dead, you will look just like this." I can't think of any other place than Mexico that embodies this carefree attitude towards death the most. Because when I think of dancing skeletons, I'm immediately reminded of the holiday Dia de los Muertos, and how many Mexicans, despite their hardships and oppressions they have to endure in their lives, they live what appears to be much more happy and vibrant lives, compared to us Americans who have an almost instinctual revulsion towards death. And we wonder why half the nation is on antidepressants and constantly obsessed with chasing after everlasting youth and longevity. The great paradox of pondering our mortality is that it doesn't inhibit our happiness, but rather enhances it, and that if we act like we're going to live forever, it makes our souls die on the inside and slowly shrivel up. The spiritual exercise memento mori doesn't have to apply solely to the individual, however. Our next melite thanato, or spiritual exercise, derives from one of the OG Stoics, Epictetus. In its Enchiridion, he instructs his students to engage in what Stoics called the kiss of death. Epictetus says, quote, "If you are kissing your child or wife, say that this is a human being, a mortal, whom you are kissing. For thus when they die, you will not be disturbed." End quote. This is one of the most infamous passages in all Stoic literature, because Epictetus intended for this advice to be taken quite literally. This may sound grim and morose, but its intention is to help deepen your love for each other, because the precious moments you share with your loved ones will not last forever. By contemplating the transience of our relationships, it will not have as much psychological weight on our minds for when our loved ones do eventually pass away. By contemplating the transience of our relationships, it will not have as much psychological weight on our minds for when our loved ones do eventually pass away, and we will be much better equipped for it for when that sad day inevitably comes. The next spiritual exercise, if you could call it that, is one that I personally come up with, and that is to hyper-plan out your own funeral. This doesn't mean just wondering whether or not you would want to be cremated or placed in a coffin under the ground, but rather it is an intense visualization of every single moment of your funeral in hyper-precise detail. Planning your own funeral is the last time you can put in effort into how you want people to remember you beyond this physical plane. How many people do you want to be at your funeral? Do you want a large collective with all your friends and family, no matter how brief a connection? Do you just want numbers? Or would you rather want a small, intimate gathering who shared your most precious and intense moments of life together? How do you want to give back what has been given to you? Do you want your body to naturally decompose back to the earth and let your nutrients feed new life forms? Or do you want to be cremated or placed in a coffin? Or do you want to be like Jeremy fucking Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, who literally taxidermied himself so he could be put on display in order for his body to provide further utility in the realm of progress and science? Another question you could ask yourself is, what kind of vibe do you want for your funeral? Do you want it to be reverent, polite, having others respect your wishes beyond the veil? Or do you want a celebration of life where people party and drink and reminisce on the good memories you share together? One of my favorite questions to ask myself when planning out my funeral is, what do I want the soundtrack to look like? Yes, of course, I'm recommending you make your own funeral playlist. Do it today, or tomorrow, or whenever. Just do it before you die. I know that as they lay my body into the ground personally, I want the song Parabola by Tool being blasted on the speakers. This is because its lyrics are so affirming of life, and I feel it would help my loved ones grapple with my death in a healthy way. The lyrics goes like this: "Recognize this life as a holy gift, and celebrate this chance to be alive and breathing. This body holding me reminds me of my own mortality. Embrace this very moment. Remember we are eternal. All this pain is an illusion." In a way, that is one of the last messages I will pass on to my loved ones, and I want to make sure I leave them with words of comfort and joy in that regard. In the end, there are no right or wrong answers here when planning your own funeral, because you'll be dead and you won't be there to experience it anyway, so it doesn't really even matter how it turns out, because you won't be there to know. But it still doesn't hurt to try and steer things in your direction if you want to have an impact on your last worldly affair. One other thing I think I would like to have at my funeral is that I've pre-written a grand announcement declaring whether or not I was truly a happy man and lived a fulfilling life. Aristotle once said in the Nicomachean Ethics, "Call no man happy until he is dead." Happy is a bad translation in this instance because in the Greek, happiness means eudaimonia, which is better interpreted as the good life. Eudaimonia was not a transient feeling, but a lifelong state of action in accordance with virtue. So no one can know whether they lived a good life until they are at the very end of it, which is rational because Aristotle said that the most prosperous man may encounter great disasters in his declining years, and can spoil the whole lot of life. Kind of like how Game of Thrones had a really great start, but a really terrible ending that just ruined the entire show. It's like that for life. Aristotle thought one can only determine this if they can be content with how virtuously they lived throughout their entire life, until they are at the end of it. I want my death day at my funeral to be my pronouncement to the world of a life well lived, and to serve as a model for others seeking eudaimonia and happy lives. Now, we have covered a lot of westernized Greek spiritual exercises so far, but this podcast would not be called the Philos-Hippie if I did not incorporate at least a little bit of Eastern philosophy into our meditation of death. It is not surprising in the least that the philosophy in Buddhism has a plethora of meditations on death that makes the Greeks pale in comparison. Essential to Buddha's practice is mindfulness of death, or maranasati in the ancient Pali. Maranasati is simply the combination of the Pali word marana, which means death, and the word sati. If you are familiar with meditation, you may be familiar with the term sati because it simply means mindfulness or remembrance. Maranasati is somewhat similar to memento mori in that it helps us to remember our mortality. But Buddhists use maranasati as a practice of remembering that death can strike at any time, and by familiarizing ourselves with this, we won't be shocked and feel out of control when death inevitably comes. Buddhists meditate on death because maranasati is said to be conducive to right effort, one of the tenets in the Noble Eightfold Path. Maranasati aids us in right effort because it prioritizes what truly matters in this life, and develops a sense of spiritual urgency, samvega in the Pali. Samvega is also defined as the oppressive sense of shock, dismay, and alienation that comes with realizing the futility and meaninglessness of a life as it's normally lived. It's a kind of chastening sense of our own complacency and foolishness in having let ourselves live so blindly, and an anxious sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of the meaningless cycle of samsara. Death is the ultimate deadline, and the fact that our lives will cease is the ultimate motivator to get our house in order and finally start doing the things we are all called to do, which for all humans is to live with compassionate wisdom and to love others unconditionally. And Buddhists, rooted in the utmost spiritual pragmatism, had a plethora of spiritual exercises oriented towards death, and I couldn't possibly list them all or else this episode would never end, but I picked out some of the most common ones and most applicable for our daily lives. One of the most important Maranasati practices comes from the Puthajjana Sutta, and in it resides the 5 remembrances. The 5 remembrances are meant to help us greater understand life's impermanence and reduce our fear of death by contemplating or reciting the following maxims at least once a day, according to the monks. They are as follows. 1. I am of the nature to grow old. There is no escaping old age. 2. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no escaping ill health. 3. I am of the nature to die. There is no escaping death. 4. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no escaping being separated from them. 5. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. So, there's absolutely no escape for any of us. All of life is transient and passing away, and so are we. These 5 remembrances naturally lead us to some visualization death meditations within the Theravada tradition. The first is the corpse or cemetery meditation, in which you would sit down amongst gravestones and in great detail, imagine yourself decomposing alongside all the corpses around you. You simply sit and imagine your body going through all the stages of decomposition. You may picture your body one day into death, then 1 week, then 1 month, and 1 year, and so on until eternity. It's like an imaginary time-lapse of your rotting body. Your body may get scavenged upon by coyotes or vultures. You may see your skin deflate into a mess of wrinkles. And you may see your body lose all of its meat, being reduced to bones as a dog tries to chew on your femur bone. It may sound grim and morose picturing yourself in this way, but it helps to loosen our attachments towards this body which we inhabit by familiarizing us with the natural processes of life and decay. Another death meditation that pairs well with the corpse and cemetery meditation is the last breath contemplation. Here, you vividly imagine your last waking moments on this planet. Your vision may begin to blur and darken as your hearing begins to fade away. You may lose control of your bodily functions. Hell, you may even piss and shit yourself. This all happens as your body breaks down and you feel your heartbeat slower and slower until it doesn't thump anymore. And up until that last heartbeat, your breath will get weaker and weaker, fainter and fainter. Your chest rising and falling will barely be visible to you and those around you as your body slowly starts for air, and you'll try to seek relief, but you simply won't be able to until death finally brings it to you itself as you breathe your last breath. So, that concludes the spiritual exercises I gathered together to help us master our craft in the ever-elusive art of dying. By regularly contemplating and practicing these death meditations, we are rehearsing our demise so that we can live life more graciously than when we entered it. Even though we can only aspire to die as calmly as Socrates when he drank the hemlock, or be as selfless as Siddhartha Gautama as he spent his last moments on earth, teaching the Dharma to just one more student, we can rest content in ourselves that we will feel more prepared for our death if we continue to practice the art of dying and to keep philosophizing until our last breath. If you have made it to the end of this video, then I hereby commend and congratulate you as I heap copious amounts of praise onto you. You, dear listener, have the mental fortitude and resilience to stare death in the face while listening to me babble endlessly about skulls, cemeteries, rotting flesh, decomposition, and the impermanence of our physical natures. Not anyone can do that, because the denial of death is so rampant in our society today. It is still too taboo to talk about these ideas with others, because it risks confronting their own mortality, and many are too afraid to face that head on, so they just neglect it altogether. Like me. The whole reason why I wanted to talk about the art of dying today is because I too get afraid of death at times, even after all this contemplation, and even being in the prime of my life. However, I do feel less afraid of my death nowadays after studying philosophy, which has brought my soul enormous comfort and courage. However, the fear of death still creeps up on me during the times I forget to live out my practice. This whole episode and all the spiritual exercises, militate, thanatile, death meditations, whatever you want to call it, it was ultimately a reminder to myself, honestly, to live these truths out in my life, and hopefully, it helps to awaken to do the same in you. Death does not have to be scary, but can actually be life's greatest teacher. It can inspire us to live more authentic lives, instilling in us this spiritual urgency that all of this could stop at any moment. The art of dying, in the end, is inseparable from the art of paying attention. And as you're about to go about your day once this video ends, I want you to pay attention, right here, right now, and recognize that you are still alive. You are still breathing. Feel the breath in your lungs. Feel the breeze on your skin. And realize that there is still time left to seize the day. Because one day, there won't be any time left. Because someday, this will all end.